Every year, millions of people take the ferry from Manhattan to the most iconic statue on Earth, New York's Statue of Liberty. They climb to the pedestal, photograph the green copper figure with the torch, and read the plaque about huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Almost none of them look down. If they did, they would find themselves standing on a fortress in the shape of an 11-pointed star. A structure older and stranger than the statue it now carries, with a geometry that appears nowhere else in the entire documented history of American military engineering. The official explanation is that the fort was simply a convenient pedestal already sitting on the island. By the end of this video, that answer may seem like the least interesting thing about the structure beneath Liberty's feet. The Statue of Liberty, as it turns out, was never quite about freedom in the way the public has been taught. It is a specific monument with a specific set of symbols, commissioned and dedicated by a specific organization and placed with great deliberation on top of a structure whose true origin was already obscured by the time the statue arrived. The official account of how it came to be there is so smooth, so well rehearsed, and so universally repeated that almost nobody pauses to test it. But the structure is still there. The geometry has not changed. The stone can be measured, the angles compared. And once you start comparing, the cracks in the official version begin to spread in every direction, outward to a network of near-identical structures scattered across Europe, Russia, and the Americas, and backward to a body of symbolism that has been quietly scrubbed from the public-facing history of the project. Let's start with what the government websites will tell you. The structure beneath the statue is called Fort Wood, named for Lieutenant Colonel Eliza Wood, who was killed at the Battle of Fort Erie in 1814. The fort was built between 1808 and 1811, designed by a young army engineer named Joseph Gilbert Totten as part of the coastal defences the United States threw up in the anxious years before the War of 1812. The island it sits on was known as Bedloe's Island, after a Dutch colonist who had owned it in the 17th century. After the war, the fort drifted into secondary uses, and by the 1870s, when the French began discussing the gift of a colossal statue, it had fallen into disuse. The 11-pointed star walls were already standing. They made a convenient base. The statue went up on top of them, and that, according to the official account, is the whole of the story. There are several problems with that account, and the first is the engineer himself. Joseph Totten is not a mysterious figure. He's one of the most thoroughly documented military engineers in American history. He graduated from West Point in 1805, spent his entire career in the Corps of Engineers, and rose eventually to become the chief engineer of the United States Army. He designed and oversaw dozens of coastal fortifications along the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. His plans sit in the National Archives. His correspondence with the War Department fills volumes, and in that entire exhaustively preserved body of work, there is nothing else that resembles Fort Wood even slightly. Look at what Totten built in the years on either side of Bedloe's Island. Fort Adams at Newport, begun in the 1820s, is a pentagonal bastioned fort with hornworks. Fort Monroe in Virginia, begun in 1819, is an irregular hexagon. Fort Macon in North Carolina is a 5-pointed star. Fort Pulaski in Georgia is a pentagonal casemated fort. Fort Sumter, on which Totten worked extensively, is a pentagon. The pattern could not be more consistent. Totten designed pentagons and hexagons. He used straightforward bastion geometry built around clear lines of fire. His work is competent, conventional, and instantly recognizable as the American military engineering of its day. Fort Wood is none of those things. It is an 11-pointed star with a geometry that has no parallel in any other Totten design, no parallel in any other American fort of the era, and no discernible defensive logic at all. Why would the engineer who built clean pentagons everywhere else suddenly produce an 11-pointed star at Bedloe's Island, leave no explanation for it, and never once repeat the design across the rest of a long career? That question has never been answered. It has simply never been asked. The second problem is the masonry. The walls of Fort Wood are built from cut granite blocks, fitted together with a precision that was genuinely unusual for American military construction in the early 19th century. The corners are dressed with finished edges. The joints are tight. The stones are large, regular, and laid in courses that speak of generations of accumulated craft. That is not what American forts of the pre-1812 period generally look like. The Republic was young and its treasury was thin. Forts went up fast with whatever labour and material could be found nearby, and they show it. Functional, serviceable, and rough. Fort Wood does not look like the hurried work of a cash-strapped young republic. It looks like the product of an established European masonry tradition, the kind that raised the great star forts of the Netherlands, of northern Italy, of the German principalities. The stonework is simply too refined for the time and the place. Set it beside the masonry of Totten's other projects, and the contrast is immediate. His documented work looks American. Fort Wood looks European, and not merely European, but belonging to a tradition of fortress building that was already regarded as antique by 1810. The third problem is the geometry itself. 11 pointed stars are not a feature of standard military engineering. The great bastion forts of the 17th and 18th centuries used 5, 6, 7, or 8 points. The Vauban tradition that dominated European fortress design from the late 1600s almost never went above 8, for the simple reason that there was no defensive advantage in doing so. Every additional point narrowed the field of fire from each bastion, made the perimeter harder to garrison, and complicated the lines of supply. From a purely military standpoint, 11 points is an irrational choice. It is not a Vauban choice. It is not a Cohorn choice. And for the reasons already laid out, it is not a Totten choice either. So whose choice was it? The 11-pointed star turns out to be common in a completely different tradition. It appears repeatedly in the architectural symbolism of certain European fraternal societies, in the cosmological diagrams of the Renaissance Hermeticists, in the floor designs of particular cathedrals, and in the heraldic devices of certain old orders. In the Western esoteric tradition, the number 11 carries specific associations: the threshold, the gate between one world and the next, the principle of mastery. An 11-pointed star at the mouth of a major harbour is not a defensive work. It is a statement, and on the reading that a growing number of independent researchers have put forward, the people who set an 11-pointed star at the southern entrance to New York Harbour were not thinking about cannon fire at all. They were marking the place with a symbol drawn from a tradition far older than the United States. This is the point at which the story stops being about a single fort. Because Fort Wood is not unique. It belongs to a whole class of structures found across the world. Structures that share the same design features, cluster in particular regions, and suffer from precisely the same explanatory problems we have just traced at Bedloes Island. In the Netherlands, in the small border town of Bourtange, there is a star fort conventionally dated to the late 16th century, though its underlying foundations have never been properly excavated, and its alignment matches that of Fort Wood to within a few degrees. In northern Italy, the city of Palmanova is laid out around a 9-pointed star wrapped in an inner ring of 18 bastions. In Hungary, at Komárom, there is a fortification system the textbooks hand to the Habsburgs, yet whose lower courses, on close inspection, show stonework that predates Habsburg control of the region by centuries. And across the vast territory that older European maps simply labelled Tartaria, there are dozens of star fortifications, many of them in remote country, a striking number of them built to 11 or 12 points, all of them officially attributed to 19th century Russian military construction, and almost none of them supported by construction records that survive any real scrutiny. The same pattern surfaces in South America. The city of Cartagena de Indias, on the Caribbean coast of Colombia, is ringed by a system of star fortifications credited by the standard history to Spanish colonial work in the 17th and 18th centuries. But the masonry, looked at closely, shows several distinct periods of construction, and in many places the lower courses appear to predate the Spanish arrival entirely. The geometry belongs to the same family of designs found at Bedloes Island, at Palmanova, and across Central Asia, and the Spanish, by their own colonial records, did not design these works from nothing. They incorporated existing earthworks and stone foundations into their defences. The earlier structures are described in the early Spanish documents as having already been present when they arrived. As to who had built them, the Spanish never established. The local indigenous population had no tradition of monumental stone fortification of this kind. The structures, in the words of one early Spanish military engineer whose report survives in the Madrid archives, were of a type and quality that pointed to a culture of which the local people retained no memory. That is the pattern mainstream history has never been willing to assemble in one place. Star forts of complex geometry are not, on this reading, an invention of late medieval and early modern European engineering at all. They are far older and far more widely distributed, and the named European engineers who took the credit for them across the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries were, in a great many cases, inheritors rather than originators. They walked into landscapes already studded with these structures. They repaired them, folded them into their own military plans, and wrote them up in their official reports in language that left the impression they had designed them from the ground up. The reports went into the archives. The archives became the raw material for the historians of the later 19th and 20th centuries. And the question of where the structures had actually come from, a question openly discussed in the older travel writing, quietly disappeared from serious academic conversation. It is worth looking at what that older travel writing actually said. Before the modern academic establishment had organised itself around a single tidy narrative of European architectural history, European travellers described what they saw with a frankness that later scholars would find inconvenient. The German diplomat Adam Olearius, travelling through Muscovy and Persia in the 1630s, described star fortifications deep in the Russian interior that the local inhabitants attributed to a vanished civilization. His account, published in 1647, was a bestseller, translated into several languages and treated as a standard reference on the region for over a century. The German naturalist Engelbert Kämpfer, writing in 1712, described similar structures in Central Asia and reached the same conclusion. The Frenchman Jean Chardin, in his account of travels in Persia, described fortifications that matched no known historical construction, and that the local people said had simply always been there. Taken together, these accounts paint a consistent picture. The territory east of the Vistula and south of the Volga was, in the 17th century, dotted with monumental star fortifications whose origin nobody could explain, which the local populations attributed to a vanished imperial culture, and which the European visitors recognised as finer in workmanship than anything being built in their own time. By the late 19th century, all of this had been quietly written out of the standard histories. The structures were reassigned to 19th century Russian military construction. The travel accounts dropped out of the curriculum. The local oral traditions were filed away as folklore, and the question of what had actually been built, where and by whom, became something no serious academic could raise in public without putting his reputation at risk. This is the moment of the rewrite, and it happened across Europe and Russia, across Asia and the Americas, in the same handful of decades, driven by the same kinds of institutions, with the same result everywhere. The world had inherited an enormous architectural patrimony. The new academic establishments of the late 19th century took that inheritance and reassigned it to a far smaller and far more recent set of named engineers, none of whom had the resources, the manpower, or the years required to have actually built what was credited to them. The lie was never stated outright. It was a lie of consistent omission, repeated until it became indistinguishable from history, and this is the context that Fort Wood belongs in. The 11-pointed star at Bedloes Island is not a curiosity. It is one node in a global network. The masonry, the geometry, the alignment, all of it points to the same older tradition of monumental construction, found scattered across the territories of historical Tartary, across the older fortifications of Europe, and beneath the inherited colonial defences of the Spanish Americas. The structure was already standing when the United States took possession of the island, and the American engineers who took the credit for it in the early 19th century did exactly what their European counterparts had been doing for 200 years. They folded the existing structure into a new official story, dated it to their own period, attached a named designer, and wrote it up as though it had been raised from nothing. So what was Bedloes Island before it was Fort Wood? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, because the records of the early colonial period are thin and the records before it do not exist at all. What can be said is that the island had been used and reused for 2 centuries before the official fort, that there are scattered 17th and 18th century references to structures on it that do not fit the conventional explanation, that the 11-pointed geometry of the existing walls sits squarely within the broader pattern of inherited star fortifications around the world, and that the choice of this particular site, with this particular geometry and this particular alignment, for the placement of the most prominent monument in the harbour was not an accident. On the deeper reading, the men who chose it knew exactly what was already there. They knew its symbolic associations, and they chose it precisely because of them. Those men are not anonymous. The statue was designed by the French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi. The project was originated by the French politician Édouard de la Boulaye. The pedestal was designed by the American architect Richard Morris Hunt. The fundraising was run by Joseph Pulitzer. The internal iron framework was engineered by Gustave Eiffel. All of them, by the public record of their lodge memberships, were Freemasons. And the cornerstone of the pedestal was laid on the 5th of August 1884 by William A. Brodie, the Grand Master of Masons of the state of New York, in a public ceremony that followed the traditional Masonic rite for the consecration of a structure. Corn was scattered over the cornerstone, wine was poured, and oil. The stone was struck 3 times with a gavel. A copper box was sealed inside it, containing a copy of the Constitution, copies of the day's New York newspapers, a list of contributors, and other items that have never been fully catalogued in any public source. Hundreds of Masons attended in formal regalia. It was reported in the papers at the time. None of this is hidden. It is a matter of public record. The dedication of the finished statue 2 years later was attended in the same way, by Masonic dignitaries from across the country. The iconography of the statue examined closely follows the conventions of the same tradition. Bartholdi's liberty is not the liberty that America had pictured before her. The earlier American figure of liberty had been Columbia, a woman in classical robes, often with a Phrygian cap or a sword, generally modest in scale and domestic in tone. Bartholdi's figure is something altogether different. She is colossal. She wears a crown of 7 rays. She holds a torch and a tablet, and she faces outward toward the open sea in the stance of a guardian set at the gate. The closest historical parallel to her, by Bartholdi's own admission, is the Pharos of Alexandria, the great lighthouse of the ancient world, itself a colossal figure standing at the mouth of a major harbour. Bartholdi had in fact developed the original version of the design for an entirely different project, a colossal lighthouse at the entrance to the Suez Canal, in the form of a robed Egyptian woman holding a torch aloft. The Egyptian project never went ahead. He reused the concept for the American one. The figure that now stands in New York Harbour is, in its direct iconographic lineage, an ancient lighthouse goddess, placed on top of an 11-pointed star fortress of unexplained origin and dedicated with the rituals of a particular fraternal order. The 7-rayed crown is itself a deliberate choice, not a generic flourish. In the iconographic tradition Bartholdi was working within, 7 rays answered to the 7 planetary spheres of the older cosmological systems, the 7 rays of the older solar religions, the 7 graded levels of certain initiatory traditions. The torch was the torch of illumination, in the precise sense the word carried in the writings of the European Illuminist movements of the 18th and 19th centuries. The tablet, which the public version reads simply as the Tablet of Law or the date of the Declaration, carried older associations in the Hermetic tradition with the tablets of esoteric law. None of these associations are inventions. They are documented in Bartholdi's own correspondence, in the writings of his collaborators, and in the published statements of the Masonic organizations involved in the project. They are simply not part of the version of the story told to the millions of tourists who pass through every year. Assemble all of it, and the conclusion is hard to avoid. The Statue of Liberty was never at its core about freedom in the sense the public has been handed. It is an iconographic monument drawn from a specific symbolic tradition, dedicated with the rituals of a specific organization, and placed with deliberate care on top of an 11-pointed star fortress, whose origin was already obscured before the dedication took place. The immigration story, the huddled masses, the gift from one republic to another, was a layer of narrative paint applied over the actual symbolic content. And the actual content on this reading was a marker set at the entrance to one of the great harbours of the New World, in the same symbolic language that had been used to mark the great harbours of the Old One, in a tradition reaching back through the lighthouses of the Mediterranean to the goddess figures of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The 11-pointed star at the foundation is the deepest layer still visible. It was there before the statue, before the Fort Wood story, before the American Republic existed in any meaningful sense. It points back to a tradition of monumental construction that the modern academic establishment has collectively chosen not to look at. It connects, by its geometry and its alignment and its masonry, to the whole network of inherited star fortifications spread across the territories of the older European empires and the lands the old maps called Tartaria. It is the single most visible piece of evidence, sitting in the most photographed harbour on Earth, that the story we have been told about how the modern world was built is not the story the physical evidence on the ground actually supports. And if the 11-pointed star is part of that older inherited tradition, then the history of New York Harbour itself starts to look different. The Dutch did not sail into an empty wilderness in the 17th century. The English did not inherit a blank canvas at the end of it. The Americans did not raise a new harbour on top of nothing. They inherited, layer upon layer, a landscape that had already been organised and built upon by something earlier, something the standard history has chosen to forget, and whose physical traces are still there for anyone who decides to look. The 11-pointed star is the most prominent of those traces. It sits in plain sight, photographed by millions every year, while the public-facing story trains every single visitor to look up at the statue and never down at the structure holding it. And the same pattern repeats from one American harbour to the next. The old fortifications of Boston Harbour, the structures on Alcatraz and Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, the river forts of New Orleans, the harbour defences of Charleston. Every one of them carries the same anomalies: refined masonry that does not match the historical period, geometries that do not match the standard military traditions, construction records that thin out and vanish the moment they are examined, official explanations that collapse as soon as the physical evidence is taken seriously. Every major American harbour has its own version of the Bedloes Island story, and every official tour guide, every National Park Service brochure, every textbook chapter on early American history is, in its small way, part of the same project, the project of training the public not to look down. Take the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, Florida. The standard account dates it to Spanish construction beginning in 1672. It is built from a local limestone called coquina, fitted with techniques that the Spanish colonial archives themselves describe as exceeding the ability of their own engineers in the region. Its four-bastion star geometry matches the older European tradition more closely than any documented Spanish design of the period. Its walls absorbed cannon fire across 3 documented sieges without structural failure, a performance the Spanish themselves found surprising, and which they attributed in their own correspondence to the unusual properties of the stone. The Spanish reports held in the archives in Seville describe the early phases of the work in language consistent with the incorporation of pre-existing earthworks and foundations rather than the raising of a new fort on a virgin site. The standard textbook account, of course, describes it as a Spanish original from beginning to end. Or take Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, 60 miles off Key West. The standard history describes it as an American construction begun in 1846, a 6-sided polygonal fortress containing more than 16 million bricks. Officially, it was never finished. Construction is said to have continued for nearly 30 years before being abandoned, but the American military of the supposed construction period did not have the manpower, the supply lines, or the budget to have produced what actually stands on that island. The bricks, the masonry, the engineering of the cisterns and the casemates all point to a scale of organised construction beyond what the documented American operations in the region could have achieved in the time allowed. The explanation has held for over a century, but the arithmetic of construction does not support it. And the alternative, that the Americans inherited and extended an existing structure rather than building from scratch, is not seriously entertained in any mainstream account. These are the inherited layers the official story has been carefully edited around. Once you know how to see the pattern, it becomes obvious in every major harbour and at every major early American military site. The public is simply not encouraged to see it. The textbooks do not invite the comparison. But the structures are still standing, and this is not a small matter. The largest monuments of the modern world, in the largest harbours of the modern world, have been raised on top of structures whose origins were erased from the public record. The erasure was not subtle, and it did not require a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was achieved with the ordinary tools of 19th century academic statecraft. Reissue the textbooks, stop translating the older travel literature, reattribute the inherited structures to recent named engineers, train a generation of historians to repeat the new official line, then wait for the witnesses to die and the original archives to crumble. Give it a century, and the new story becomes history, while the actual history becomes the kind of thing only a conspiracy theorist would raise. But the structures are still there. the 11-pointed star is still at the base of the most photographed statue in the world. The geometry has not changed. The alignment has not changed. The masonry can still be examined by anyone willing to walk the perimeter and look. And what you find when you do is not easily set aside again. The Statue of Liberty was never simply about freedom. It is something older, stranger, and far more specific than the version handed to the tourists will ever admit. The 11-pointed star at her feet is a door, and if you are willing to open it, it leads to a much larger question about what was actually built in this world before the modern academic establishment decided, on our behalf, what we were and were not allowed to remember. The star sits in plain sight at the entrance to the busiest harbour on Earth. It has been sitting there the whole time. The only thing anyone ever had to do was look down.